We're going to discuss today the situation in the United Kingdom, which has always had what some describe as an awkward relationship with Europe. Some refer to it as disjointed or detached. It is a latecomer to European unity, as you know, having joined only in 1973. Not always or only for its own reasons. But it is true that the issue of joining the EU and being a part of Europe has always been a part of British politics, British domestic politics. You might say that Great Britain has a sort of identity struggle as it deals with the narrative of its own history, in which it has always been of, but not necessarily in, Europe. That has changed, faute de mieux, by the post-war world, and to some extent by the post-Cold War world, and it is about to change again. In 2013, pushed by his own Eurosceptics and challenged by the UK Independence Party, Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron pledged that there would be that the British people would, quote, have their say on this question, and that if he were re-elected in 2015, there would be a referendum on membership. He was re-elected. Indeed, Conservative Party got a bare majority in the Parliament, able to rule on their own, thanks in part to the Scottish, shall we say, abandonment of Labour and the collapse of the Liberal Democrats. But David Cameron's promise was tied to his ability to renegotiate the terms of UK-EU relations, which he in fact did in a deal that was completed this past February, which we can talk about should the panelists so desire. He, in a sense, has gambled that his deal will be enough to secure continued British membership in the EU, something he and his government favors, but something he will not be able to proceed with if the vote goes against him. This raises many questions that have to do with, to begin with Great Britain. It has to do with its identity, with its economy, with British borders, the mobility of its people, finance, its budget. So on an individual level, all of these things are affected by this vote. On a governing level, there are questions that would be raised by a leave vote that affect Scotland and Ireland and Northern Ireland. In addition, some people raise the issue of Great Britain's global role. Would a non-EU Great Britain continue a long downward trend of, to put it bluntly, irrelevance in global politics, or conversely, would it make Great Britain more powerful because its foreign policy would not be shackled by an EU bureaucracy or lassitude in foreign policy? It also raises a question, may I have the first slide, please, for the EU. Now I'm going to do what they call push content here and put up a slide, which you may or may not be able to see. Let me see the next one. If you look at the EU and we consider the EU, the UK in the EU, click, it is the third most populous country in the EU. It's the third leading economy as measured by GDP. It has the highest level of defense spending. Indeed, the UK and France are probably the only EU members with an independent military capability. It has the highest military expenditure per capita, and the second largest number of personnel. Transatlantic, it is the second leading trading partner with the US. Viewed within the EU, EU proportion of British trade varies a bit, 38 to 48% over the last 18 months of British exports, 51 to 55% of provision of British imports. So clearly the UK, you can take that off, is an important actor in the EU. And many people raise questions like the following. Will there be others who argue for renegotiation or exit? Marine Le Pen in France has already begun to talk about a Frexit. The Polish government, already hostile to the EU, has made clear that it will demand renegotiation. And we just saw a Dutch vote rejecting the Ukrainian treaty, which some say is already fallout from the EU. Can the EU itself maintain itself as a global actor if major members like this disappear? Conversely, is it the UK's job to stay in just to keep the EU a major foreign policy actor, which it might never become anyway? Is that part of Great Britain's role? The third theme is transatlantic, and it's phrased in fairly harsh terms. You all remember that we're from Mars and you're from Venus. So it's phrased in terms like, why would the US continue to take Britain seriously if it's no longer in the EU? It'll be a much less powerful country, thus the whole transatlantic relationship will be in question. So other than those trivial questions, there's almost nothing to discuss. Nevertheless, I invited a distinguished panel to address these questions, and they have agreed. And I especially appreciate it from my British colleagues, who of course are probably missing their tea in order to join us today. Amelia Hadfield is reader in the School of Sociology, Politics, and Sociology at Canterbury Christ Church University. She has been there since 2013 and has been awarded not one, but 2 Jean Monnet chairs. She must have an office full of chairs right now, in European foreign affairs. She has spoken out on this question and been a frequent panelist, but she is also an author of a book on British foreign policy. And one of my favorite books, I have to say, is her co-edited book with Stephen Smith on foreign policy, theories, actors, and cases. She's a student of comparative foreign policy. Tim Oliver is the Darendorf Fellow on Europe-North American Relations at the London School of Economics. He has been a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst, and his work specializes in US-UK, US-European relations. Indeed, he is the author of A European Union Without the United Kingdom, The Geopolitics of a British Exit from the EU, published this year. Alan Sked is Professor Emeritus of International History, also from the London School of Economics. He is, of course, an expert on the Habsburg Empire, which is definitely why we invited him to join us here today. His second book on the subject was The Decline and Fall of the Habsburg Empire. But he has also written a post-war history of Great Britain, among other things. And while he wasn't doing that, he was, in fact, the founder of the UK Independence Party, a party to which he no longer belongs. We always like to have the University of Pittsburgh represented here, and we are indeed represented today by Michelle Egan, well, she probably doesn't think so, who is a professor of international service at American University in Washington, and a frequent commentator, including most recently at the Wilson Center, on the question of Brexit. Her PhD in political science is from our department here at the University of Pittsburgh, and she is the author, among other things, of research agendas in EU studies, Stalking the Elephant, I think she's referring to her colleagues, and Constructing a European Market, Government Regulations, Standards, and Governance, by Oxford University Press. So thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to actually begin, since Amelia, and I did mention that I was going to refer to you familiarly, has written on British foreign policy. So let me ask you to address the question of this Brexit move now. What is different about it from past aversion, you might say, to European unity, European Union unity? Are we seeing something different, or is this just more of a British tangle with Europe?
Thanks very much, Ron, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be on the panel, and I commend the European Studies Centre for the initiative. So thanks very much for the local buy-in. Let's put it this way. I'm glad you started with foreign policy. I was rather hoping that I'd get this question and also that I'd get it first. I know my colleagues are going to want to weigh in on this. When you were speaking, I think about the distinction between Britain as a global actor and the European Union as a global actor. Obviously, we're talking, I think, a variety of different types of asymmetry here. One of the main flaws in the current debate, of course, has been that we've heard very little about the role that Britain has played in an expanding and increasingly robust European Union. The EU has a long way to go in terms of being a sort of a major or even a mega actor in foreign policy terms on the world stage. But where it is now is very much as a result of British leadership in foreign and security policy. And it's a shame, I think, possibly, because I teach this, I feel this is very, close to my heart. It's a shame that this part of the dilemma of the debate is not getting the play that it should be. Everything seems to be turning around the sort of reductio ad absurdum take on, is it going to be, the fear associated with in and out, and the economics associated with it. It's purely the economic implications. We've heard very, very little about the foreign policy dimension. And I think if we were to expand that and sort of deepen it out, we would be able to point to very good examples of British leadership within the emergent foreign and security policy area and even identity of the European Union. So I think my first suggestion would be a plea for greater intelligence in terms of understanding the depth, and I think Tim can probably expand on this a little bit more with regards to the British development in terms of EU foreign policy actorness. But beyond that, I think if we were to sort of turn this around and charge EU member states with their own understanding of how Britain has operated in terms of deepening, or if I can just use the term, the strategic depth, if you like, of the European Union. I think we've seen a strong and complementary series of leaderships struck between Britain and France, between Britain and Germany in this respect. I think we've seen some strong and intelligent use of development, and I also think we've seen some strong leadership in terms of the use of the neighborhood policy. I know that some of these things have become incredibly complicated of late because of their foregrounding with the migration crisis. But if the Brexit dilemma that we're looking at this point could be deepened somewhat in terms of looking at Britain's foreign policy credentials, its diplomatic credentials, its ability to strengthen in terms of strategic depth, what the European Union is now and what it is capable of being in the future, I think we'd be able to see not only an incredibly strong and central role for Britain to continue to play in the European Union, but a much more complementary series of external dynamisms, if you like, between the European Union and Britain. That's all I'm going to say on this at this point, but I do hope we come back a little bit more to the foreign policy point.
Tim, let me take a cue from Amelia and follow up with you. First of all, do you agree with her in terms of the judgment of the significance of the UK to the EU? And secondly, is that the UK's job to prop up a foreign policy which has been a long time in the making and might never come to fruition if it doesn't benefit the British people?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me today. It's great to be here online. In terms of the importance, yes, the UK certainly has played a key role in developing this. I wrote a piece the other day with Oliver Dadow from Nottingham Trent University, challenging the idea, and you mentioned at the beginning, Ronald, of Britain as an awkward partner, and saying, well, actually, it's not always been an awkward partner. It's actually been sometimes very constructive in the European Union. And I always point out, people misquote Stephen George, whose title of his book was An Awkward Partner. People misquote it by saying the awkward partner, and it's not the. There are lots of countries in the EU which have been a pain in the ass, not just the UK, it's just the UK has been the most awkward. And on foreign policy, yes, it has been a key actor, although perhaps this shouldn't be taken too far because this has been to the service of other ends, such as for NATO, for the transatlantic relationship. It hasn't necessarily been just for the benefit of European integration. In terms of going forward, what is interesting is, if you think about it, whatever the result of the referendum in, I think it's 65 days' time, The one area where the UK will have to continue working with the rest of the European Union or Europe more broadly will be foreign policy, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Syria, the Middle East, and so forth. If Britain votes to leave and is trying to rebuild relations, find some way of showing that it can kind of have a trusting relationship with the EU, then foreign policy is going to be the one area where the UK can move forward. But equally, if it votes to remain, what can Britain actually do? It can't lead on Schengen. It's not in Schengen. It can't lead on the Eurozone. It's not in the Eurozone. It can't really lead on competitiveness and so forth. Those are issues which everybody accepts are a good idea. The one area it can lead on is foreign policy. So Britain, whatever the result in the referendum coming up, will probably fall back on its usual hand of playing the foreign policy card and trying to do something in that area. But it will remain hamstrung by its own unease about this, and also, if it's an outvote, how the rest of the EU will respond to cooperating with the UK that's now on the outside.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to come back to that, but I want to turn to Alan Sked because neither Amelia nor Tim really answered my question, so you have to stay after school. What I want to know, and you'd be in a good position to address, Alan, is how different is this movement now in Great Britain, or the attitudes now, than what we've seen in the past, the debates over joining in the first place, the historical relationship? Is it a different situation now, or is it more of the same, in your view?
No, I think it's very different, because this time the people of Britain actually have a vote for the first time since 1975 to decide for themselves, whatever the government thinks, on whether to remain in the EU or not. And I think we're going to decide to come out. I hope we're going to decide to come out. But it's not just sort of speculation. This is actually decisive. One way or another, on the 23rd of June, the British people will make a decision about their future in Europe. And this is something that most British people have never had a chance to do before. They've just had to listen to the small supranational unelected clique that runs Europe and has voices in Britain and vested interests in Britain, hearing them say what's good for us. But now there's going to be a chance for the British people to actually say, no, we don't agree with any of that, we're going to come out. So it will be decisive in a way that noises off and general speculation have never been in the past.
Do you think it's also different? Do you think it's also different because this time there is a political actor in Britain whose major plank is to get out? That is, there's a party around whom people can focus and join their point of view, where that didn't exist before.
Well, yes, of course it is. I founded the party. I mean, it was my
idea. That's why I asked you.
Yeah, I came up with the idea that pressure groups didn't work, and that the only way to force a conservative government into taking us out of Europe was to challenge it at the polls and to force them to come to a decision. Now, my strategy, after many years, is now working. A Conservative Party in UKIP was founded to put pressure on the Conservative Party to take us out of Europe. A Conservative Party is now split down the middle. Oh, well, it's not split down the middle. 70% of members and a majority of MPs in the Tory party are for coming out. And as I say, I'm hoping what I started will now reach fruition with an exit vote on the 23rd of June. But it's different in that sense, yes. I mean, the Tory party majority is in favour of coming out, and UKIP is in favour of coming out. The pro-EU parties, the Lib Dems, were smashed at the last election. Labour was smashed at the last election. And so there's now a kind of vacuum almost on the opposition, the pro-EU side, because this time the majority of the main public political figures are silent, because, let's say, Labour and Lib Dems are more or less hors de combat, and the majority of people inside the Tory party and in UKIP, of course, are for pulling out.
Alison, can you put up the next slide? Speaking of the vote and opinion, I want to address the question of public opinion in Great Britain and look at, you can go all the way through those. look at what appear to be I don't know if you can see this, but this is the Financial Times Brexit poll tracker, which shows that right now, as of 4 days ago, the stay are just barely ahead, 43 to 42. Next slide, please. But probably more troubling for proponents of staying is the movement, which you can see in the top, where those who favored staying in less than a year have dropped from 50% to down to 43, almost to be joined by those who want to leave at 42. I should say that this is not one poll. The Brexit poll that Financial Times uses is an average of polls, which is really the best way to do it. Could you hit the clicker one more time? But most troubling is probably this undecided vote, which is put in at 13%, and which, as you can easily see, if those people actually vote, will turn the election. So Michelle, let me turn to you and put you on the spot. You can now remove that so people can see. What is behind this significant drop? Number one, and number two, I'm going to ask you to do something that political scientists hate to do, which is to make a prediction. Which way will those undecideds go?
That predictions are hard in politics. You know what, Ron, I'm here in Washington, and I want to remind everybody about the vulnerability of polls. We remember the Scottish referendum, where a lot of the polls were, and also the last election in May 2015 for the British government. Polls we need to be cautious of, I think, because we've been burnt a couple of times recently about the polls. But in terms of if you look, Harold Clark and Paul Whiteley have been tracking the polls since 2010 through 2016. And it went through a high point in 2013 when there was much more support for remaining in the EU. But you know what? The momentum has really moved to the Brexit side. They've been getting their message out. The polls have been tightening. And as you know, there's a real generational divide in Britain. You know, the polls indicate that the younger sort of student youth population is more likely to vote to remain, but the older population over sort of 50, 55 is more likely to Brexit. So we're seeing a real clear generational divide. And the concern people have is who will show up? Will young people come out sufficiently to make a difference? And so that's a big factor. And the second factor in terms of the undecided, some of the concerns we have in polling is the YouGov tends to focus on online, which takes the young people's votes. The landline polls tend to be more FT, and they tend to get the older votes. So it's really hard. I want to say the momentum is moving in the Brexit direction. Very much, slightly. Having said that, I'm here in Washington, and Obama, as a foreign policy decision, will be in Britain on the 22nd. And the indications are he's going to make a big public outreach to persuade the British voters to stay in the EU. I don't think it'll make that much of a difference, but a lot of people are paying attention to it here in Washington.
I'm going to come back to that on the U.S. side, but I want to stay with the domestic politics for a moment and go back to you, Alan. I'm somewhat surprised by what Michelle just said, that young people are the ones who want to vote to remain, and the older generation wants to leave. Typically, in American politics, an older generation is more conservative. They are worried about change. They want to keep things as they are, and it's young people who go, challenging into that good night. Do you think what she has said is correct, and can you explain why that might be?
I don't know if it's correct. It's what opinion polls are supposedly showing. My own explanation is that, when I was their age, when I voted in 1975, and when I was a teenager in my early 20s, I was a mad European federalist, and I believed all the propaganda about Europe creating peace and bringing us together and being progressive and democratic. And I think younger people want to hear that kind of message. It's the kind of thing they hear from Bernie Sanders in the United States. And I think they're naturally idealistic and not simplistic, but they're hopeful, and they hope that the ideas that European federalists say are behind Europe are actually real, whereas the older generation, who've actually experienced life in the European Union for decades or more, and are more cynical because of that experience, they know the difference between reality and promises. And they know that the European Union is now in decline, that it hasn't got much promise for the future, that its future is behind it, and therefore they want to get out. It's young, I said, students who still swallow the propaganda from Brussels that it's the country, United Europe is something of the future. It's not going to happen, but they haven't got the experience to take that in yet. Sorry.
I'm going to stay. Thank you, Alan. I'm going to stay with this topic, Alison. Can I have the last slide for just a little bit longer? And I'm going to ask my panel if I should completely ignore this. When David Cameron went to Brussels, he negotiated a deal. And his premise seemed to be that he would sell the deal to the British public for a new relationship with the EU, dealing with the most serious concerns raised by UKIP and others, and that they would be voting on what would be this new arrangement. Most of you are aware of the details, which include, for example, the ability to restrict, that's the one. First of all, there's the exemption from the pledge of ever closer union. The emergency brake, which allows a reduction of benefits for a fixed period of time to workers who come to the UK, even EU citizens, and an indexing of family benefits to the family members they leave behind. An explicit reiteration, really, that UK and non-Eurozone countries have no responsibility for a bailout, general statement of financial regulation, and a general statement on being freed from business regulation. But my question, I'm going to pose this to you, Amelia. Does this matter to people as they look at this and decide where to vote? Do the particulars of this make a difference, or has it been negotiated and then forgotten?
Thanks very much. I'd just like to take slight issue, if I may, with what Alan said before, just touching on it just a moment, and then I'll come to the questions of the negotiation. Can we please make a distinction between the types of demographics that we have going here? I think it's a little bit simplistic to fall into the sort of the polarity of just because we've got ins and outs doesn't necessarily mean we can make stock characterizations about old and young. I think it's a very, very complex demographic. It's one thing to say that, an older generation has an understanding that the European Union is in decline, but I think it's quite another to suggest that the young are not intelligent and sophisticated, and I cite my students sitting behind me. They're perfectly capable of understanding and reading, and taking an intellectual and a pedagogic interest as well as a conceptual one in the European Union. And we've had some very strongly thought seminars on this effect. I think what's interesting is that they're capable of understanding the sophisticated nature, not uncomplicated nature, admittedly, of the European Union, and balancing it up as a form of multi-level governance, as a form of global governance, as an aspect of regionalism, as an aspect of micro and macro, where Britain has a specific sort of role within that. So I'd just like to kind of make that plea for a slightly more sophisticated overview, if we could. And then I think from beyond that, the idea of the Cameron deal, it's difficult, I think, for those of us who were hoping that he would come back with a good deal. In a sense, I think and I'm interested in Tim's opinion on this, I wonder if he maybe just deepened the British default of an opt-out. When in doubt, stay on the sidelines. To some extent, I think he's reinforced the concept of economic and fiscal safety with regards to the promises brought back on finance and business and the Eurozone and whatnot. But at the same time, I think he has tried to reassure those who have a sort of paranoia or even a pathology about deepening, that the sort of ever closer union, which is, really just a sort of concept of governance, that it doesn't shift from that to sort of pure panic, or even a sort of a deep belief system. I think there is something of a break attached to it. The idea that Britain continues to have a political say, an economic say, and as we were talking about before, something of a foreign policy say as well. I'm sure we're going to get into market bases in a minute, but I think the pull here is somewhere between autonomy and access. I think that's the sort of the duality that we're looking at here. So I think Cameron struggled. There was only sort of a limited amount of scope that he was able to work within, in terms of being able to nail down what's effectively, for those of you who know your foreign policy, it's the two-level system, a win internationally that doesn't screw you domestically, and also something acceptable and tolerable in your constituency that doesn't hamstring you internationally when you go back to that all-important summit. And somebody's going to have to go back to Brussels on the 24th of June. They've already moved the summit just for that. So I think what we're looking at was a reasonable attempt by Cameron. It was never going to please everybody, but it was a pretty judicious attempt at pulling together the left and the right of the spectrum with regards to fiscal concerns, economic concerns, political and security concerns.
Tim, I'd like you to, I'm sorry, Alan? Alan, hold on 1 second. I'm gonna go to Tim, and then I'm gonna come back to you, and Allison won't let me forget. Tim, I want you to say what you think this deal is worth, but also I want to pick up on something you pointed out, which is, after all, Great Britain is not in Schengen. And if, for example, one of the major concerns of British voters is immigration, refugees, then this deal says nothing about that, because it wasn't part of the negotiations. And as you pointed out, Britain's not in Schengen. It made its own deal at the end of the collapse of communism and continues to do so. So is it possible that this deal is just window dressing, and the things that British people care most about is not even touched by that?
Well, first of all, I don't think most people in Britain will or have paid that much attention to the deal, apart from those of us who follow this. I think Cameron hoped that it would have a bigger effect, because the polling said if you come back with a deal, people will be more inclined to support to stay within the European Union. In terms of the immigration, you will hear a few Remain campaigners, and especially the Prime Minister, say that we did a deal whereby certain in-work benefits will not be available now to certain EU migrants. Of course, the numbers involved are tiny, it won't make any deterrent and so forth. But what is more interesting, if you think ahead, yes, the immigration issue is one of the defining issues of this referendum. It will come up. But unfortunately, the referendum won't necessarily settle that. I mean, Britain is going to remain a very open economy. It's going to continue to need people, especially here in London, which soaks up large numbers of international arrivals in terms of workers from not just Europe, from all over the world. And that's one of the tensions inherent in UK politics. At the beginning, you mentioned Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I think you might want to add London to that list in terms of where London is placed within the UK and its particular needs. But what I recently started with a whole network of people around the European Union was to ask them what they think their government's red lines and negotiating positions will be over an exit negotiation. And it's already becoming very clear that the one red line that will cause real uproar and real tensions will be freedom of movement. And that if the UK wishes to remain in the European Economic Area, it's going to have to allow freedom of movement to continue to a large extent. Therefore, if people think that this referendum is going to kill off the immigration debate, it's going to stop immigration, give Britain complete control of its borders and so forth, I think they're going to be disappointed.
Alan? Thank you, Tim.
I just want to say that nobody is talking about the terms that Cameron brought back. They've already been forgotten, and we're only starting the debate. When he came back, the British media and press completely rubbished his terms because they were so trivial. And in fact, Cameron doesn't seem to cut any figure at all in Europe. The very fact that they gave him such trivial terms showed contempt for him. And then we saw, I mean, you say President Obama's coming over. President Obama said that the only major initiative in Europe that Cameron was involved in, the war in Libya. They'd made an absolute mess of it. The last thing we saw in the British press was that David Cameron had triumphed. He had negotiated with 27 other European heads of states and secured an abolition of a 5% VA tax on condoms. This was supposed to be a diplomatic triumph for the British Prime Minister. Can you imagine Palmerston Disraeli bothering to negotiate with heads of state over condoms? It's a situation to which the EU has reduced the British Prime Minister. But no one's interested in his deal with Europe. It was derisory.
I'd like to point out that our blue jeans system has certain trigger words, and condoms is probably one of them, so it probably cuts out, and I won't follow that line of conversation. But I will throw it to Michelle Egan, who's in Washington, and therefore used to hearing such kind of language.
Okay, Ron, I think there's a general sentiment that the deal was a lot of theater and that the actual conditions and terms, a lot of what he negotiated is already on the table. You know, the idea of competitiveness, the trade negotiation with the United States, that's, you know, sort of completing the single market, that's currently part of the current agenda. So that wasn't particularly innovative or new. So to some degree, I agree. Once the deal came back, it's not been part of the campaign. It's not been at the forefront. It's all been forgotten, except for us who are academics who look at this. But I will say that we've forgotten our history. You know, Alan will remember the deal negotiated in under the previous administration for the last referendum, and that was really marginal. I mean, Britain went to vote on the common market in 75 on a deal that wasn't very significant either. But what was interesting was the packaging and how they sold it. And they sold it as, you know, the looking at the polls, looking at what happened, the margin then. So what's different between this campaign and the last one? Then, we, as Alan pointed out, we only had a small period in the EU. Now we've got a longer time. So I do think that, you know, there's something to be said about, was that a high-risk strategy to come back with a very minimal agreement? It was never going to satisfy the Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party anyway.
One of the, I'm just positing the future role of the British humiliation of the British Prime Minister over the issue of condoms, and whether or not this will go up there as one of those Euro myths like the curve of the banana that we read about that turns out not to be true. But we'll get back to that. I want to address this is slightly a campaign aspect and more importantly an analytical aspect. We have seen a number of significant actors weigh in recently on the economic impact of a Brexit. The IMF has warned in dire terms. Successive European foreign ministers. The British government just today announced that one of the consequences of a Brexit would be a fall of more than 6% in British GDP, leading to a substantial £36 billion deficit or gap in the British budget because of taxes that are lost. We saw a piece about how investors are running the other way, hiring is on a hold. I guess I have two questions. One, does this analysis seem to hold up? And two, does this have the hallmarks of a desperate campaign in the face of falling numbers by the government to try to scare people into voting to stay? And I will let any one of you who wants to take this one. Alan, go ahead.
Sorry, these figures you might as well go to Magic Meg and her horoscopes and ask for future predictions like that. The Treasury always gets them wrong. It was wrong over the ERM. It was wrong over entry into the euro. It didn't see the 2008 crisis coming for all its predictive power. And the IMF had to apologize to George Osborne, the Chancellor, just a year ago for saying that his policies weren't working and then changing its mind and saying they were doing very well and he was the best Chancellor in Europe. All these people make predictions. It's all pie in the sky. They're all trying to scare the British electorate, and the British electorate quite clearly isn't listening and is not being scared because they don't believe that behind it there's anything more than propaganda.
Tim,
they're wrong in
you on this. Right.
Right.
Alan, you have to try to be more direct and frank and not sugarcoat it the way you do. Tim,
I think
let me turn to you. You have written the most, in what you might say, the most empirically based work on this topic. And I'd be interested in your take on these admittedly future-oriented analyses.
Okay. I mean, first of all, which work are you referring to there? Is it the because I'm not an economist, but I'd have to defer to economists on this topic. The two things I will say on this is first of all, as Alan pointed out, people do question whether the Treasury is going to get this right, the IMF and so forth, and this is part of a wider trend in that people just don't respect or don't trust institutions, especially the political institutions at the top of the British government or internationally or within the European Union. So it's a part of a wider lack of faith, you might say, in what these institutions can do and whether or not they've got these things right. That does beg the question of, well, what do you base this on then? Just emotional gut instinct? Or do you base it on something more in depth? In which case, who do you turn to other than just the Treasury with its methods, think tanks, you turn to different consultancies around the world? Who do you actually rely on at the end of the day? And facts will, to some extent, matter. But what I would say is one thing which I don't think many people saw coming about this referendum campaign was the role that things like the National Health Service are playing in this. If you want to save the NHS, you should leave the EU, is one of the campaign mottos, basically, of the Leave campaign. If you want to avoid the NHS being privatised by TTIP, you should leave the European Union. That's one I heard the other day. This is very questionable as well, but there's a certain logic behind it, just like there's a certain logic behind the Treasury's figures and methods behind all this. But it's part of this is a lack of faith within the British political institutions, which do seem by many to have kind of lost their way, especially given, and I go back to the London issue earlier, they're London-based. There's a certain anti-London vote. There's a certain issue with London going off at a tangent. Most people don't recognise this city, which is the capital of the UK, but is now overwhelmingly different to the rest of the UK, and where a British political system largely serves the demands and interests, of course, of this city.
I want to go off, Michelle, I see you, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but I want to go off on a tiny little tangent that I've seen. It's a minor chord in the debate, which is that has to do with London and the fact that you raised it. That London is, in many ways, the financial capital of Europe. It's the clearing area for the Eurozone, even though it's not obviously part of the Eurozone. How could that continue if the United Kingdom is not part of the EU, and therefore wouldn't that be a wrenching dislocation and a huge blow to the London economy, or is that overheated rhetoric?
For me, yep.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I think London will make money out of this result, whatever the result is. The city of London. People forget that really within the UK, the part of the UK that has arguably the most robust and diversified economy is London. It's not all financial services. London is a huge IT sector. It's a large service sector in many different fields. It's a huge tourism sector. It's even still a large manufacturing base to some extent. So London will probably thrive whatever the result is. It will take a hit. I think if there is an economic cost, and we can debate that another time, but if there is one, if we imagine it for a moment, the economic cost is likely to be borne elsewhere in the United Kingdom. If that happens, you could easily see Londoners, or at least those Londoners who vote to stay in, and the polling at the moment shows that Londoners are likely to vote to stay in, not overwhelmingly like in Scotland, but more than likely to vote to stay in, Londoners will say, well, hang on, you all voted to leave. Now there's an economic cost and you expect us to pick up the tab because London is the largest contributor in terms of taxes to the UK. So you've got this political dynamic within the UK of London versus large other areas of the UK, which Europe could bring out. It's not just people worry that Scotland may go off if it votes to stay in the EU and the UK votes to leave. Well, Londoners themselves might not necessarily feel best pleased if the country they're the capital of decides to drag them out of the European Union and there's a cost borne elsewhere that they have to pick up the tab for. But in terms of the city, they'll make money out of anything. They're very ruthless capitalists.
I have seen one analysis which follows that logic and says that with the differences in Scotland, what would become, let's say, much more of a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, now London, are we talking about the fate of the UK itself as a result of this vote and any denouement that follows? Whether we are or not, that's a question that Michelle will now address.
Can I just...
It's in terms of the economic impact. We just don't know. I mean, the question becomes, if there is an exit to leave, what would be the actual negotiations that emerge afterwards? Now, what we can think of, we can think of three, people are putting different scenarios on. We would be in the European Economic Area, we would be like Norway, and we would also have to still contribute to the budget, the EU's budget in Britain. But then they would sort of argue, well, perhaps that's not the model. Perhaps we'll have a more Swiss model. And so we really don't know what the end game would be. And we're assuming that Britain will direct that end game. But there's going to be 27 other states that will have a say here on what kind of economic architecture or relationship will be. I think the general sort of feeling amongst the financial sector is that there'll be a lot of uncertainty and financial volatility ahead of Brexit. We might see a fall in the currency, some recession, some high interest rates. That's the message you're hearing from people, particularly in the financial sector. And some of the hedge funds are talking about relocating elsewhere, particularly some of the American foreign direct investment. But the other point that Tim makes is that we have a number of, say, perhaps law firms that may be thinking about making a mint in what happens now with Brexit and what kind of advice can we give to our clientele about corporate tax, industrial relations, and everything else. But, we don't know, because we also know that Britain is part of the WTO. So what kind of tariffs will Britain offer? Will it go for unilateral tariff liberalization, or what kind of tariffs it will set? And the final thing I think we need to think about as well is the domino impact on countries that are very integrated with the British economy. And the two that come to mind who've been doing their own economic scenarios are the Netherlands and Ireland. We're treating this now as if the British economy is not connected to the rest of the world. Global supply chains mean that we're connected. I will say this, business. We haven't talked about business. And on the one hand, while the CBI has come out very definitively to remain, the Institute of Directors has been, coming out lukewarm, but they're very concerned, a number of small and medium companies, about the sort of onus regulations coming from Brussels. So there is a mixed view. Predominantly the British business say remain, but there is a segment that want to come out as well.
At this point in the conversation, I always like to offer our attendees, either here at the University of Pittsburgh or watching us from FIU or in Illinois, if any of them there would like to ask a question. If you do so, raise your hand, and I only ask that you identify yourself and ask your question. Jonathan.
My name's Jonathan Hill. The question I have is, if Britain votes to exit the EU, I assume there's going to be some immediate attempt to then negotiate a free trade agreement of some kind with the rest of Europe and other kinds of agreements that would presumably offset some of the things they might lose from exiting the EU. Is there any talk then about a free trade agreement right now with Europe?
Yes, Alan.
The main assumption in the Leave campaign is that Britain will quickly negotiate a unique free trade treaty with the European Union, ideally with the objective of having zero tariffs across the board. Tariffs on the whole are very, very small already, and we would like to have no tariffs at all, absolute free trade between Britain and Europe. And we think we could do that quite quickly. Capitalists are not going to stop wanting to sell us their produce, and we don't want to stop selling things to Europe. So the main drive in favor of a quick deal will simply be capitalism, the profit motive, keeping trade going. And we think that if we have a zero tariff agreement, we can get that quite quickly.
Michelle.
Yeah, I
Go
mean,
ahead.
we've forgotten how many free trade agreements the EU as a whole has with the rest of the world. And the US, perhaps to frame the debate, to push the debate in one direction, Ambassador Froman here and others have been very, very clear. You know, we care about TTIP. We want to negotiate with the EU as a whole. And they've been trying to tell the British, we do not want you necessarily, you know, there's no guarantee you'll get a free trade agreement as Britain quickly. Now, that's not to say it wouldn't happen down the road, but Alan's right. You know, tariffs are close to zero, but we still are part of a WTO system. We're still part of a legal infrastructure that we will then have to start looking at. But the trade negotiation issue will be very, very complicated. And the question will be, we won't give up our access to the single market. We have these supply chains with other countries that were embedded in the single market. The question is what kind of agreement we can get with the EU member states as one, but with the rest of the world as well. Remember, we will be, you know, doing a trade agreement as Britain with the US versus the EU with the US. And Prime Minister Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, was in Washington several weeks ago, and we hosted him. And he made the comment, not very politely, that Britain would be a mid-sized economy in the middle of the Atlantic. Now, you can see that as both good or bad.
His advisor must be Alan Sked.
No comment.
Wait to see
Amelia.
the prophets of doom.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The prophets of doom will be proved wrong. They were proved wrong over the euro. They were proved wrong over the ERM. Every time Britain says she's not going to fall into line with Europe, numbers of people are mobilized to say this is the end of the world. Well, it's not the end of the world. All the banks that were supposed to move and all the car companies that were supposed to move out of Britain when we didn't join the euro are still here. They're booming away in Britain, whereas in the eurozone is stagnating, going backwards, and the whole thing's been a disaster.
I'm so tempted, since you're a Habsburg historian, to pursue that analogy pre-World War I, when all the countries were sure that a war would never occur, and they would solve all the crises until they wound up being right. But we're not going to go there. Amelia, I promised you we would get back to foreign policy, and I want to do so in the following way. As Michelle mentioned, President Obama is about to go to Great Britain, and clearly he will indicate what his preferences of the U.S. government. Let me read you a quote from Richard Haas, a former of the State Department and a very influential American foreign policy commentator. He says, "A simple reality must be kept in mind. The European integration project that began in the wake of World War II has helped to bring unprecedented stability and prosperity to much of the continent for 3/4 of a century. A British decision to sue for divorce would add to centrifugal forces already in evidence. Nationalism and populism, already on the rise for both economic and social reasons, would gather even more momentum. It would be difficult to feel confident of the outcome, however uncertain that may be." He goes on to say in the article that the US will simply not want to deal with or take Great Britain seriously if it's outside of the EU. And my question to you is there any merit to that argument? And secondly, does anybody really care what the US president has to say on this subject?
Well, seeing as I'm speaking to Americans, I think I better answer the latter question in the affirmative. And seeing as he's here next week, I think I better put an underline under it. Yes, I think people do care what the U.S. president has to say, and I think the much vaunted special relationship continues to be a key construct, not necessarily perhaps an axiom of transatlantic relationships. I think perhaps it's rather more favorably regarded, possibly from this side of the Atlantic, and rather more expediently regarded from the other side of the Atlantic. But I'm going to wear my Canadian hat, which puts me right firmly in the middle of the two, and I can sort of see the merits of and possibly the demerits of both of them. Let me just return briefly to the Haas quote, which I think continues, to be very, very relevant. I think in terms of understanding the European Union and also teaching it, its pedigree as a peace project really cannot. We cannot afford to underplay it, to undermine it, or to neglect it in any sense. I think the idea of security in Europe, stabilization, prosperity is a very, very strong and potent message. And when it is structured in terms of governance, I think it can be a very stable, very long-term message as well. I think the concept of trying to make that simple in terms of power is a very, very difficult one. And I think one of the problems with the Brexit dilemma is that power has all too easily been rendered in zero-sum terms. More for Brussels is, intrinsically less for us, as if power were some absolute, very, very, simple understanding, when in fact it will always be very, very relative principle and concept. And this is something I think that Britain understands in many ways, but it hasn't filtered down, into the Brexit dilemma. In fact, it's become very, very polar. Let me just finish off by talking a little bit about the US's ability to understand Britain should Britain pull out of the European Union. I think there would be deep disappointment. I think the US has regarded for a long, long time the UK as quite an able partner, as a sort of complementary transatlantic partner in getting transatlantic viewpoints, particularly these more hard power. You mentioned Kagan before, much more sort of focused, top of the spectrum, high intensity approaches to world affairs over to the Europeans, sitting on their sort of Venusian pedestals. So I think there's a sense there that perhaps the Brits are good at translating and possibly interpreting for Europe. At the same time, I wouldn't want to sort of take that too far. Britain has played a very extensive autonomous role, and works very nicely, I think, in setting up a sort of a two-way conversation between Europe and the United States as well. And I think a good example of this perhaps has been in the European External Action Service with the first chief there, Baroness Catherine Ashton, a Brit, and who for the entire length of time of her tenure had to make very difficult foreign policy choices that represented the European Union on one side, worked with the United States on the other, and yet in many, many ways was sort of fundamentally British at the same time. So I think it's not for nothing that Obama is going to come over with really a clear understanding of the incredibly high stakes game that Britain is now playing, and is going to pitch whatever Boris Johnson says. He's going to do his very damnedest, I think, to try to make the strategic point, the economic point, and for want of a better word, the sort of transatlantic cultural point, and to plead that Britain think twice before taking a very big decision in this respect. And I don't think, and I disagree with Alan with all respect in this respect, I don't think it's it's everybody got wrong before. I think this is the biggest generational decision that we've seen. No one has ever pulled out of anything as big as the Union before, and I with all respect to sort of Algeria with regards to France and Greenland, this is the first really big step we've seen. Let's hope we get it right.
Alan.
Hello, I have to go in a couple of minutes. So could I just make 2 or 3 closing remarks? First of all, the
Please.
British already know what Obama's opinion is. It's not going to make much difference. He'll be listened to with respect. Some people will actually think it's counterproductive that he should interfere in a British domestic debate. Secondly, with regard to peace in Europe, the EU represents pacifism, not peace. Thirdly, the British represent military and intelligence cooperation with the United States and NATO cooperation. And whatever happens with regard to the EU, the United States will need British input with regard to military and intelligence cooperation. That's the real basis of the special relationship, nothing to do with the EU. Now, having said all that, I'm sorry. I've enjoyed this very much, but I have a 94-year-old mother to attend to, and I really have to go. So thanks very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Alan. Give our best to your mother.
Thank you.
What a shame.
Okay, Michelle, you get to follow Alan Skedd's mother.
I get to follow Alan Skedd's mother, who she might be one of, the students are getting these little postcards that say, Gran, get your Gran to vote for the EU. It's been wildly popular on campuses. Have you gotten them? Yeah. No, my comment would be, for the students who are listening to this, what you're sort of getting here, bringing in NATO, bringing in intelligence cooperation and so forth, has there been an overreach of the EU? It's a great final question for your exam. Has the EU overreached? Okay, but my more serious comment is that one of the things that I think is very important here is, Amelia really pointed out the perceptions of the special relationship, the transatlantic relationship, in a very nuanced way. But one also has to remember that the United States is a Pacific power, and it's not just an Atlantic power. And Obama is much more cerebral about Europe, than prior some other presidents. And so, it's a double-edged sword to weigh in on this debate, but we've seen all indications that he will in some form or fashion. And to say he shouldn't interfere, when he doesn't say things about the situation in Poland or the situation in China, and when we don't say something about human rights or backsliding of democracy, they criticize him. So, he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. And so this is really an important, the rationale is, what is the rationale for this visit? Well, the only rationale at this point, obviously they want to talk about Syria, ISIL, foreign policy, domestic terrorism in Europe. But, he's going to be asked about Brexit. And so why not preempt it and frame the debates?
To some extent, your characterization, I think, is the way I characterize pretty much the whole Europe-US relationship. When the US doesn't speak out, we're accused of not showing leadership. And when we do speak out, the Europeans say, how come you never listen to us? It's a challenge for a great power, and allows me to make a foreign policy point that I'm sure Amelia makes all the time, that great powers get criticized for what they do and what they don't do. Mm-hmm. It also allows me to segue into a slightly related topic, and I'm going to throw this to Tim. One of the arguments that's raised is that if the UK pulls out, the EU will become very much more Germanocentric, that the weight of the economics, the politics, the centrality of Germany to a non-UK EU will make it a very different kind of organization, not necessarily one that we might want.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right. That there are several.
Good, I like to be right.
There are several scenarios. So you're right that that's one of the scenarios that people foresee from a British exit. Because the main concern, just going back to the United States, and I won't say much on that because you can read my opinion in International Affairs next month, where I've written with Mike Williams of NYU about what a British exit will mean for the United States, or could mean for the United States, I should say. I think we're starting to slip into this talking about it as if it's going to happen. But we have to think about the geopolitical implications in terms of how a British exit would change the European Union and European politics. It's not just about the UK. Britain, as as Alan said, this is a domestic matter. No, it's not. This is a matter that's going to have huge ramifications for how we understand European integration, what Germany's place is, what Ireland's place. Please, I beg you all, never say continental when you talk about the rest of the EU ignoring the UK. Someone did that. I asked a French academic in Washington many years ago now what it would mean if the UK left the EU, and she said it would mean that Europe starts and ends at Calais, at which point the Irishman in the room exploded, saying, well, what the hell does that mean about my country? The scenarios are, one, Germany is strengthened. It certainly focuses the European Union on the Eurozone. Secondly, it shifts power away from Western Europe more towards Eastern European countries, which to some extent would strengthen Germany to some extent. However, there are other scenarios also whereby it could split the European Union and encourage fragmentation, especially with regard to Southern European countries that want to possibly push for more autonomy within the European Union, such as Hungary or Denmark. The key country in all this, however, to watch, of course, is Germany. The limited literature that we have on European disintegration, if we can call it that, theories, all point to one country, and it's Germany. As one of the authors, as one of the best pieces on European disintegration, Douglas Weber termed it, the European Union has never faced a crisis made in Germany. Made in Germany. Now, Douglas never defines that. I've asked him to try and define it. He's not too sure himself. It's one of those things, you know it when you see it, that the Germans have given up on the EU. You know it's game over. Whether a Brexit will do that? No, not on its own. If a British exit aligns with another crisis in the Eurozone, another crisis in Schengen, possibly something with regard to the Baltic states and Eastern Europe, then we'd be into uncharted territory. Then it's a case of the stars aligning and possibly putting a lot of pressure on Germany. But even then, how you understand what disintegration would be depends on what you see as happening. We're not going to go back to some 1939 or 1930s setup of independent sovereign states, or just sitting with bilateral relations with one another. There will remain European-wide organizations. The European Union would provide a model that Germany would almost certainly want to see reconfigured to a reduced Eurozone. I mean, this is kind of nightmare scenarios we're talking about here. So the EU completely breaking up? No, but you could see what we might term, this is something Hans Vollard, another author who's written on European disintegration, said you might see partial withdrawals. Britain maybe leaving, Hungary maybe, Greece dropping out of the Eurozone if that's plausible. But the core European area, the core European Union around the heart of Germany, that will almost certainly remain in place.
It seems hard to believe, my rational actor political science colleagues would argue that being rational actors, if Britain renegotiates a deal to its benefit, then the queue will run all the way to Warsaw. And they'll say the same thing. We want this, and you get not just a two-tiered Europe, but a multi-tiered Europe. And then if you have a multi-tiered Europe, do you have a Europe at all?
Yeah, just very quickly, the key issue here, if you think about how the EU will respond to a British exit, it comes down to what I call the 5 I's. The first one is ideas. Eurosceptics are very keen to point out that the European Union is a political project. They're right, it is a political project. It has certain political ideas behind it. But at the same time, they then say, if we leave, it's going to be interests, especially economic interests, that are going to define how the rest of the EU responds to us. It'll be German car manufacturers, Irish farmers, and so forth. They will put significant pressure on the rest of the EU that the EU will agree to a good economic deal for Britain. And yes, you can see that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to which one's going to win out. Is it going to be the ideas and the politics of European integration and European unity, especially from a German perspective, or will it be the economic interests that actually prevail? I suppose you could put it down to, in terms of how you view the EU. Do you view it as in terms of realist perspectives, it all comes down to interests, whether it's economic and security, which will also come into this, or are you a constructivist and believe it's all about the ideas of European integration that drive European integration? That's what will define the response of the rest of the EU. And just very quickly, there are 3 other factors, 3 other I's. Institutional issues. The EU is limited in what it can offer, partly by what it's offered other countries, and also by WTO rules, for example. There are international pressures. As I said about foreign policy, there will be pressure on the UK to cooperate. The UK itself will find itself in an awkward position of not being able to ignore the EU, which will remain the predominant political and economic organisation in Europe. Although one nightmare scenario sees the UK trying to use NATO as leverage, just like Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus have used this issue in terms of, well, we'll boycott NATO if we don't get a good deal with the EU. I mean, you can see how well that would go down on your side of the Atlantic. And then finally, the finalised individuals. Just think for a moment how Angela Merkel and the other EU leaders who negotiated that renegotiation with Cameron, and yes, there was a lot of theatrics, but it still took a lot of effort. How are they going to respond when David Cameron walks back in the room at the next European Council and says, sorry, I now need to negotiate an exit? You can already hear the slow hand clap as he walks into the room like, well, thanks, David. We've got elections coming up in our domestic politics, and you're now going to ask us for a good deal. We're not going to have the domestic will to give you that deal right now. It's going to take time.
So, Amelia, is there any truth to the rumor that if they make a movie of this, you're going to play Angela Merkel?
Really, that's
It's a rumor I just started,
yeah.
actually.
I was hoping I was looking a little bit younger. I don't know.
I must say, we haven't got time to follow this, but I must say I find the sentiment you quoted, Tim, from Weber about that there hasn't been a crisis made in Germany to be, as we used to say at the United Nations, at variance with the facts. One could argue that until now, the most serious crises that the US faced have been because of Germany, including the Eurozone crisis where their banks fell overboard to lend to Greece and then said, now you have to behave, or the refugee crisis in which Frau Merkel welcomed everybody and with consequences. But unfortunately, we don't have that time to address those questions. But Amelia, I do want to stay with you for one more minute, especially on the following issue. The EU does pretend, as you from the beginning, pretend to be a global actor, to join the United States in some actions around the world, and among the most important are the relations with Russia, which has, of course, in the minds of some, redrawn the post-Cold War borders. And EU sanctions, EU pressure have made a big difference. Can the EU be a partner in foreign policy? Can it really be a partner at the table in such a situation if the UK is not a member?
I think it's going to have to be. Russia's not going anywhere. And I think the European Union is going to have to face up to the fact that the neighborhood policy that it tried, I think, with a lot of good intentions back in 2003, has fallen apart, has not been fit for purpose. And I think this is most notable in the Maghreb and the Mashrek, but it's most important at this point, I think, in terms of its collapse materially and substantively with regards to the very, very mixed messages it's set to its Eastern partners, the Eastern Partnership in particular. It's going to be very much more difficult, I think, without having the strategic depth afforded by Britain. There is going to be a hole there, I think, to some extent. At the same time, the neighbourhood policy is not strictu sensu traditional forms of foreign policy, and as you can see, the main method by which the European Union has responded to Russian belligerence has been via sanctions. Those would still stand, I would imagine, would even if Britain came out. The problem is, of course, if Britain decided as a separate political entity not to regard the sanctions and to start making its own bilateral deals, especially in the energy sector, for example, that I think that could create problems. So you would face a difficult the issue of trying to assume that British political solidarity would be align, to use Tim's word, with the European political outlook and the pressure that they're trying to impose and continue to sustain upon Russia. I think it would be a very uneven three-way split, and I'm really hoping that's not going to happen. But in terms of the European Union's ability to continue to be a power and to be a partner, I think it has worked extremely well, not only with the United States, but with Japan and Canada, at least in terms of the sanctions. And I think we have seen quite a shift in terms of the Russian perspective from this corner. I think one thing we might like to think about is the European Union's ability to remake the neighborhood policy. Neighborhood policy, of course, has had very, very bad press, quite rightly, in the last year, and it's having to be broken down and sort of reconstructed again. And there have been a whole host of consultations. I'm sure Tim is, very, very much aware of this, as am I. And I think, we're waiting, some of us with bated breath, to see what 2.0 or even 3.0 looks like in terms of the EU's global strategy, which is going to be unveiled in June. It's rather I think it's rather horrible that it's going to be in June, just at the time of the referendum, of course, because the Action Service, quite rightly, has a large envisaged role, at least for Britain, as a central partner within the European pantheon. And if we now sing a rollback in structural terms and political terms and security terms, that's going to make the regional ambitions and certainly the global ambitions of the European Union that much harder. At the same time, I'd like to just go back to a couple of points that were made earlier. Europe is not going away and Britain's not going away. You are going to be looking at redefining a lot of relationships, and should therefore the worst happen, I think there are many core political and strategic values at within Britain that have a natural tendency and a natural sort of complementarity with what the European Union is going to do, and I think that will reflect within NATO structures as well. They're going to continue to need each other. There's going to be a strong sort of bilateral, foregrounding one against the other. And at this point, with the deep disquiet with regards to Russian actions in the Ukraine and possibly beyond as well, I think at least even if a Brexit does occur, British diplomacy and European Union diplomacy will, for the most part, I think, largely be on the same side. I hope that's not too optimistic. I hope there's a good, strong degree of pragmatism there.
As we approach the end of our time, which I promised you, and I'd like to stay on time, I'm going to ask each of you to do something you do not like to do, and Michelle has verified that, which is to make a prediction. I'd like to hear from each of you, and I'm going to give you each a final word, what you think will happen on June 23rd, and what the consequences of that. I see Amelia's already polling her students to get their vote. She's going to hide behind them. And what you think the consequences of that will be. So I'm going to go Brit, American, Brit. And I'm going to start back with you, Amelia, then we're going to go to Michelle, then to Tim.
Can you plug me in, Ben?
Yeah.
Hang on, forget to plug
Canadian, I should have said Canadian American.
I'm Canadian. All right. Well, we've done a quick poll, and most of the heads of the students are in their hands. That's not a good start. I think we're all hoping and praying that Britain remains in. Am I right, guys? Okay, all right. I think that's the prevailing feeling in the room. I'm not given to Cassandra-like predictions, unlike one of our colleagues. But I must reflect, I think, a growing disquiet at the polls. Having said that, and Michelle is quite right on this, these are vulnerable, these are very, very, cautionary, they are fickle at the best of times, and we've got them fabulously wrong, not least in the last year. So I think I'm going to hold out that common sense, sometimes in short supply in these lovely islands, will prevail. So that's my take. It'll be a close run thing, but it will prevail.
And you're on video having said that. Michelle?
Okay, great, thanks.
Well, I tried to register to vote because I'm British. And I found out because I have been on this side of the pond, even though I hold EU British citizenship, that I'm not eligible to vote. So there's about 3 million of us who might actually be disenfranchised. But my comment, my worry is that this started out as party management issue for Cameron with the fractions in his own party. And that party management may end up leading to an exit. And we don't know what the consequences are. So I'm hoping that, there's enough concern, whether it's fear, whether it's risk, whether it's just common sense that Amelia says, the people will decide to vote to remain. Having said that, I'm not allowed to vote, so I am really upset about that.
Wow, I didn't realize that. Tim, what do you think?
Comment that
Oh,
this
you're
is.
muted.
Oh,
Go ahead.
can you hear me? Yep.
Yep.
First of all, I would completely agree that this referendum has become a battleground for the leadership of the Conservative Party, which I think is a very sad development. I think my reading, just briefly, David Cameron tried to get all the potential leadership candidates for his succession to agree to campaign to stay in. So when his memoirs come out, I won't be surprised if he's incredibly angry at Boris at taking this opportunity to try and put party kind of ambition before the United Kingdom's own interests. In terms of the result, I called the Scottish one right, which was a very slim majority. I mean, I always said it would be around 55-45. I think this one will be probably 51-49 in terms of staying in. So it's going to be an incredibly tiny result, very slim. The only thing I'd say is look at the betting markets. The betting markets right now say 75% back a vote to remain. Now, some of that is legacy issues that people have been betting that way for quite a while. But nevertheless, the betting markets think that Britain is still going to vote to stay in. But that's only 50% plus one, and they win their bet, I suppose. But it will only take one terrorist attack in the last week or so, something in Schengen, something in the Eurozone, some big event, some more revelations from the Panama Papers, and Britain could be bounced out of the European Union, almost on a kind of, and it could come down to a rainy day, and it will come down to who gets their voters out. And what will it mean? For me, I published a pamphlet through the Federal Trust last month in which I mapped out all the different ways in which another referendum could happen within the next couple of years, whether it's a slim majority, whether it's something to do with an exit vote over the exit deal, or whether this includes whether Britain votes to stay in or leaves, or whether it's to do with something connected with something else connected with UK-EU relations. The potential for further votes remains quite high.
Well, that is a cheery note on which to end, although it is a vote for democracy, I suppose. But I do want to thank each of you for staying with us through the complex topic, through this discussion. I really very much appreciate it, and I appreciate the participation of our partners in Illinois and FIU. And perhaps we'll reconvene after the vote for another consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.